Honestly, it's still something I'm very much working on. It keeps changing until we find like the right fit. But it's just a much more efficient way to work. Having worked as a freelancer as well, I think you experience firsthand that it's so helpful when you have a process that you're able to talk a client through.
Jaclyn Schiff made her way onto the show because she's authentic. She reached out recommending another guest in a very real way. She didn't just say, hi, name, I love show name, you should have this guest on. We actually talked about the episodes that she liked and the takeaways she had from the show, which means I could tell she listened to the show, and therefore, she probably did know a good guest. Well, throughout our conversation, we decided that she would also be a good guest. She's a master of making the most of your content. We talk all about repurposing, something I could do a little bit better, as well as that cold outreach that she's also really good at. We further talk about productizing services, which is something I'm doing at the moment. So as much as this interview and this episode is going to be great for everybody who listens, this is an episode that I got so much out of, and I hope you do too. But before we get to that, let's hear a word from our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by our friends at Ahoy, the easiest way to increase customer engagement on your WordPress site. Install Ahoy, create a message box, configure where to display it, and start seeing conversions come in. You can create messages for cart abandonment, upsells and cross-sells, custom support, and so much more. Ahoy's flexible conditions let you choose exactly where and when you want your message to be displayed. I've recently installed it on my own WooCommerce site, and I've already seen increased engagement. And I know this because of Ahoy's powerful analytics and reporting. You will see ROI within days of installing Ahoy, if not sooner. And that's even more true for listeners of How I Built It. You can get an exclusive 20% discount on any plan. Visit useahoy.com/howibuiltit and use the code HowIBuiltIt at checkout. That's useahoy.com, USEAHOY, useahoy.com/howibuiltit, and the discount code HowIBuiltIt. Use those today. Increase your engagement and sales on your WordPress site. Thanks to Ahoy for their support of this show. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of How I Built It, the podcast that asks, how did you build that? Today, my guest is Jaclyn Schiff of Podreacher. Jaclyn, how are you today?
Hey Joe, I'm doing really well and excited to be on your show.
Awesome. I am excited to have you on the show. Jaclyn and I have been talking via email for a few months, and we wink, wink, nudge, nudge met at Podcast Movement because this show is coming out after Podcast Movement, even though we're recording it before Podcast Movement. So Jaclyn, it was very nice to meet you at Podcast Movement.
Oh man, it was great to meet you, and we had crazy, amazing times. I mean, so memorable.
Yeah, absolutely wild. We hung out with like Pat Flynn and Guy Raz. It was crazy. Cool. So thanks again so much for coming on the show. Today we're going to talk about not just you and your company that you started, but repurposing podcast interviews, which is a very interesting topic to me since I do podcast interviews, and coming up with content is just like, I feel like it's such a grind some days. Like I'm a programmer and I feel like I could whip up a WordPress plugin in less time than it takes for me to come up with like a good content strategy. So I'm excited to talk about that today.
Me too. I mean, this is exactly what I love talking about, is developing content strategy based around your podcast. So many people are podcasting and, having great substantive interviews. There's so much information in there. And, my passion is really helping people extract that and putting it in different forms and getting it out there, right? And there's so many different ways to get it out there. So I'm sure we'll get into all of that.
Yeah, that sounds great. So before we get into that, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, I'm the founder of Podreacher. So, I think the sort of the origin story probably best begins about 2 years before I started Podreacher. I was working at a magazine here in Chicago. I had a great job, but just it was very old media sort of mentality. And for a lot of reasons, I left without having a plan in place for what was next. Very unlike me, not the kind of things I usually do. It was, depending on how you look at it, one of the dumbest life risks I could have taken. But that's what I did. And then so left the job and was like, okay, now I have to figure stuff out. I'd freelanced before. I'd say if you had to put me into a box, I'm a content strategist. That's what I really love doing. I love to create content and then think about how do you use it, and how do you reach the people you're trying to reach. I've previously worked as a journalist in Washington, D.C., so I have an editorial background, and I've done also communications and marketing, so pretty well-rounded. But like I say, I'd freelanced before. I didn't think, okay, now I want to start the next iteration of my freelance career, but I kind of got lucky and just, happened to quickly find two long-term retainer clients. And the whole reason I didn't want to freelance is I didn't want to, at that point in my life, hustle really hard, be finding new business, all of that, every month. And so when this happened, I was like, great, I'm going to do this for a little while. These are great opportunities. And I'd also wanted to travel and do the digital nomad thing. So, got set up with the clients and then traveled for a year. I spent some time in Mexico, Guatemala, South Africa, where I'm originally from. Got some extended time with the family down there. And then when I came back to the U.S. After all of that, I knew I wanted to start more of a business. I knew I wanted to do something with podcasters. I love podcasts. I like to say I was a listener before people were into cereal. Before it was the cool thing. And so I've always loved listening. I've dabbled with creating my own, did a little bit in work contexts before. And it's just always a medium that I'd loved. So this is now, 2018 when I'm looking around at the podcast space, and obviously it's exploding. Everyone's podcasting, everyone's jumping on the bandwagon. And I'm looking at some of my favorite podcast websites, and I noticed that a lot of them aren't doing a lot with the episode pages. They're throwing up a player there, right? Which doesn't do much for your SEO. Maybe they're putting a totally unedited transcript, but they're not doing a whole lot with the content from the podcast. And going back to my background in journalism, the foundation of journalism is you interview people and you create articles from it. And it's all about organizing and editing. So naturally, my brain went there. And I was like, these could be great articles which would really serve the purpose of marketing episode pages. And so I thought, let me test this out. I reached out to 10 podcasts totally cold that, I enjoyed listening to, and was like, hey, would you like some help repurposing your content, either created a highly edited transcript or articles based on this? And so out of 10 cold outreaches, I got 6 really warm responses, and 2 ended up becoming clients. So I was like, great. I feel like I might be onto something. And so I started working with them. And at that point, it was just me. And after a couple of months, I thought, I think there's really something to this. I think a lot of people are podcasting and not thinking about the rest of their content strategy. And I'd love to form a company around that. And so then started building up the company. You recently had Alex McClafferty on the podcast. Mm-hmm. Alex is awesome, and I feel like I've learned a ton from him. So he talks a lot about productized services, and so that's kind of the basic business model of what I've been trying to build. And so at this point, I'm about 9 months into it, really we started off with a a few different offerings, but really what we do is we work with podcasters to take their podcast content and turn it in and optimize it for text, right? Another way of saying that would be repurposing, but I kind of think of it as optimizing it for text. And so either into an article or long form content. And so that's the gist, I guess.
Yeah. Wow. So that's really interesting because first of all, you're absolutely right. Like a lot of shows I listen to, I'm like very upset when I don't see at least show notes as part of, when they mention something, I want to go and see, especially ones that reference like a bunch of YouTube videos. Like I want to go and I want to watch those later. But, even I feel like as a web developer myself, I've got the little blurb, I've got the show notes, and I've got the transcript, which is pretty much the conversation with maybe some ums removed. But I'm not repurposing that for articles because that can be a lot of work, which is why I'm sure people are willing to outsource that essentially to you. So it sounds like your origin story is pretty well researched. And I generally do like to ask what kind of research you did, but did you find that other people were already in this space doing it, or was it like a pretty unique offer that you were sending out there?
Yeah. And just to go back to an earlier point you made, and then I promise I'll answer the question. Yeah. So there's definitely like, I like what you said as a listener, right? And like, so we both listen to a ton of podcasts. I like to have that transcript or at least show notes as a resource. So I think there's that element, right? Is you want to have a text resource for your listener because it's hard to go back and find the place in the audio. But then I think, the distinction, and maybe this kind of speaks to your question a little bit, of what we're offering is we're saying, let's turn those show notes into a marketing asset where someone doesn't necessarily have to be a listener to have the context, but they can see this either on another website or find it, through a search and come to your website and see it as a standalone thing and be able to get the gist. And then, because more people are listening to podcasts, they will think, wow, this is interesting. I'm actually going to listen to the episode, or I'm going to subscribe and listen to other episodes. And there's I didn't focus a ton on competitors. From listening to a lot of podcasts and just reading a lot about, business through the years, I was really interested in that cold outreach that I did. And I knew that if I could get, basically my goal with reaching out to 10 people cold is I thought, let me see if I, get one kind of response. When I got 2 people to become clients, I was like, I'm onto something. So I mostly kind of focused around that. And then there's definitely some other people that are doing this. I mean, it's a good strategy and that offer it as a standalone business. But I just sort of mostly focused on, what can I and what can our team sort of offer people. And, I mentioned the productize service stuff. So that's something I've also done. I just find that really intriguing as a business model. And that's something I did a lot of research around when I thought about how do I kind of structure our workflow and structure onboarding clients.
This episode is brought to you by Pantheon. Starting a new project? Looking for a better hosting platform? Pantheon is an integrated set of tools to build, launch, and run websites. Get high-performance hosting for your WordPress sites, plus a comprehensive toolkit to supercharge your team and help you launch faster. On Pantheon, you get expert support from real developers, best-in-class security, and the most innovative technology to host and manage your websites. You can sign up a new site in minutes with a free account. You only pay when it goes live. That is my second favorite feature to Pantheon, only to the easy ability to create dev, staging, and live servers and push to GitHub. It's very easy to set those things up on Pantheon. So you can head over to pantheon.io today, again, to set up a free account. Pay only when it goes live. Thanks so much to Pantheon for their support of this episode and this season of How I Built It. First of all, before we get to the productized service, I'm saying that so I remember to bring it up. You focused on cold outreach and you got 10 out of 10, 2 clients out of 10 emails, which is, by like most conventions, really good, right? Like that's like a 20% conversion rate. Right. And with cold outreach, you generally expect a lot less than that. What did that cold outreach look like? Was it just like an email introducing yourself? You had absolutely no connection to these people whatsoever?
Yeah, like zero. Aside from the fact that I was, I was a listener or come across their podcast. I think, so wearing another hat, I've also edited a newsletter, an email newsletter called the Gmail Genius. And so that's really directed to how people use email better. And a lot of it is geared towards people in sales and marketing. So I sort of read a lot about cold email. I think the key with a good cold email is to just sound like you're human. I mean, if I had to bottle it down to one thing, right? And so, and I think one of, in a way, is my weakness almost as a business person is I do put a lot of research and thought into every outreach that I do, and that as a business person, right? I guess that doesn't scale. You just like can't be thoughtful about everything, but I just really believe in it. I know we all get cold pitch emails, and the ones that like are like not relevant are painful, and I just like cannot just would never want to come across like that. So it was really about very briefly introducing myself, because I think also when you're reaching out to someone, it's not really about you, it's about them and what they need. And so I said, I'd say something like, hey, I notice you've done all these great podcasts and a lot of the content's evergreen. Have you been thinking about doing more? Could we have a discussion about doing this, and this? And I'd kind of lay out some of the options, but just I think introduce the idea, and in the hope that they'd want to discuss it further. So that was the general approach.
Yeah, and that's a great approach. I mean, your first email to me was a cold email, but you mentioned that you have listened to the show, and you liked a recent episode when you reached out, and that's stuff that you can't really just automate, right? Like unless you have a script that just like pulls a random name from my feed, like that's too much work. And a lot of people reach out to me and they're like, I think this person would be good for your show. And then I say, why? What about my show did you like? And if they can't pass that basic litmus test, then I'm probably going to say no to them, because I want, like I think we talked about this in the pre-show, I want good content. Right. And so, your cold emails are a lot more personal. And I feel like, oh, this person actually cares about my content.
Yeah. I mean, the other person I would just bring up with that, who has like a fascinating story, is Sam Parr, the founder of The Hustle. I forget where he published this, and I can send it to you, right, for the show notes.
Yeah.
Again, the importance of show notes. But he wrote like a really extensive article about how he kind of built up The Hustle through cold emails. And like, the gist of it also was like personalized outreach and follow-up. I mean, that's another big part. Everyone's so inundated, and, when a stranger's emailing you, it's kind of less memorable. So, to follow up and to follow up well is also a skill in and of itself.
Yeah, again, that's another great point, right? Because the first cold email I see, if it sounds like it's auto-generated or mass email to me, I'm going to ignore it. Totally. And then if somebody follows up, then I'm like, all right, well, maybe there is actually a person behind this email.
Right.
So that's another really great point.
Yeah, we live in interesting times, right? Where we're like questioning, is there actually a person behind this email? But I mean, I get it.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. And like, you'll sometimes the curtain will get pulled back, right? And it's like, I got an email one time that's like, "Hey Joe, I really loved your video on product." And then I was like, "What product?" Like,
Oh my God. Exactly. Like it's so embarrassing
yeah.
when it's bad. I mean, it's
Yep.
just, yeah.
Yep. So yeah, as the more you can sound like a human, like Jackie said, you should. Um, so you mentioned a couple of times having a productized service. Can you dive in a little bit more to that? Because I mean, it seems like if you're helping people come up with content, each job is maybe a little bit different. Then maybe there's a couple of variables here, but how did you build that up?
100%. So, yes, when you're dealing with content, and I think, yeah, there's a huge temptation to be highly customized, and obviously we are customized to the specific client needs, but to the extent that we're able to each time, there's kind of a few ground rules and basics when you're working with a client and you're taking their interview and transforming it into an article that is, a readable, interesting to read piece of text on its own. So there are, systems to that. And even though I wouldn't actually say like I'm naturally a big systems person, it's so much more efficient when you're able to extract some of the steps. So for example, so we'll work from a transcript, right? We'll have the transcript done. We actually use Temi.com. I don't know if you know them. It's an AI transcript. And I just, I find it a really easy, good tool. And so we'll work from that and then, listen to the interview. So each then the podcast episode that we're working with is assigned to a writer, and the writer has been trained to listen to the episode, thinking of the target audience. So like in your case, you're probably, talking to a lot of other, founders, a lot of technical kind of founders, WordPress developers, that kind of thing. So we think about that as we're listening to the interview and then extract, because the way you would write an article for that audience is different than the way you'd write it for general and like someone who doesn't even know what WordPress is.
Yeah.
So we'd pay attention to that and then like extract the specific points, and then organize that into an article with different subheads and takeaways and whatever. So the process is definitely productized in that sense, like we have a system to it. And we also, initially, the first couple of months I was doing this, I would, offer clients, we do, custom work all the time. It was like this person wanted a batch of 10 articles. The other person wanted to work monthly. So we've kind of, when I say productize, it's sort of like we work with clients in a few different ways. So we will either work on a monthly basis. We typically work either with people who are producing regular shows, and sometimes we'll create content for every show. But then we also work with like guest people that are doing like, just as a guest on a podcast, and maybe they don't even have their own, but they then want to turn that into a piece of content afterwards. Because a lot of times people go on a podcast, they prepare, they say like a lot of really interesting things, and we want to capture that knowledge and, just help them get more out of that interview. So we have different packages based on whether you're the podcast creator or the podcast guest. And it's still, honestly, it's still something I'm very much working on. It keeps changing until we find like the right fit. But it's just a much more efficient way to work. Having worked as a freelancer as well, I think you experience firsthand that it's so helpful when you have a process that you're able to talk a client through. And there's discipline for the client and there's discipline for you. I think having that process is essential for getting to the best work and, managing expectations along the way. But it also takes, I think, working with a few different clients to know what is the most effective process that will work for most people. And so that's kind of what I've spent the last couple months trying to figure out.
Yeah, wow, that is just fantastic general advice for anybody working with clients, right? Or people, really. It's important to have a process that you could talk a client through. I feel like I'm feeling those growing pains again, like I'm learning that lesson again because I'm kind of pivoting from web development, freelance web development full-time to doing videos for hire. And the process is very different. And so like we're with a web design client, I'm like, I need your content and we're going to get the domain and the hosting and this, and here's the whole timeline and here's about how long it's going to take. And I know, and I can like build in a buffer for like, cause they're not going to get me the client or the content on time, or I'm going to spend too much time on the design. With videos, it's like, what do you want your video to be about? Like, I don't know. I need, so I need to work through that process and so I can manage expectations, like you said.
Exactly. And like, that's the thing. I think whenever, you've freelanced and you've worked with different types of clients and everyone does have different types of needs. I mean, I don't want to deny that, but I think a lot of times people are just saying things differently, but they kind of want a similar result. You can like fit it into bucket A, B, or C. And, the reason they're working with you, right, is because they want your expertise. They want you to help get them from where they are to where they want to be. And so having that system is really helpful. But again, it's, it's weird. Like if I would have thought about it, if you would have asked me 5 years ago, like, oh, would you be on a podcast talking about business systems? I would have laughed in your face. But it's, it's just been like helpful to learn a lot of this along the way. And there's a really great Facebook group. You might even find it helpful, called Productize Startups. And Robin, forget his last name, but he's the founder of Many Pixels. Okay. And there's a lot of founders in that group that just kind of talk through different pieces of this, and like, everything from what technology do you use for doing this and this thing to, aspects of how do you run the business better.
Wow, that's really interesting. I will. I'm looking at it now. I'm gonna click join. And see if there's not like a barrier, really. There's a few questions, so I'll do this later. I'll definitely link it in the show notes, though, because that sounds great. I mean, Facebook has been, it's kind of pivoted for me from like just like a place where I share pictures of my kid, which is like now Instagram, to a place where I interact with people about, oh, how do I do this? Or like the podcast movement group, for example, or the LearnDash group, like both really helpful.
Totally. And I've noticed this. I think I went through a period of like just hating Facebook and everything they do. But I am in a lot of groups that are really valuable. I personally just don't like that group format. I find it hard to find older conversations and like that kind of thing. So I wish they would solve that problem. But, I guess because there's such a critical mass of people there and because people log in so often, some of these groups, whether they're writing groups, business groups, podcast groups, are just great. So I definitely am with you on that point.
This episode is brought to you by Gusto. Now, small business owners wear a lot of hats. I know I am one of them. And while some hats are great, like doing this podcast and getting to talk to people, others, like the filing taxes and running payroll hat, are not so great. And that's where Gusto comes in. Gusto makes payroll, taxes, and managing a team actually easy for small businesses. Gusto automatically pays and files your federal, state, and local taxes so you don't have to worry about it. And as a New Yorker subplanted to Pennsylvania, the not paying my local taxes thing bit me a couple of times. So it would have been great to have Gusto then. Plus, they make it easy to add on health benefits or even 401ks for your team. Oh, and you can get direct access to certified HR experts too. This sounds like a pretty good way to kick off 2020 for your business, right? But here's the thing. Deadlines for the new year creep up earlier than you think, and you're going to want to get started now. I don't know about you, but I know that I've started thinking about this stuff around this time, and all of a sudden February or March is here and I'm like, I need to do something about my taxes. So don't wait. Let Gusto make it easier on you. As a bonus, listeners get 3 months free when they run their first payroll. This is one hat you're going to be glad you gave up. I certainly am. And you can try a bonus and see it for yourself over at gusto.com/build. So get 3 months free when you run your first payroll. Try a demo and see it for yourself over at gusto.com/build. Thanks so much to Gusto for their support of this show. So you've created a productized service. Maybe now we can go to some advice for people who are looking to kind of maybe repurpose, I know is the word you didn't want to use, but repurpose their content, whether they are a podcaster or maybe doing stuff on other people's podcasts or on YouTube or whatever. Do you have some tips for that?
Totally. So again, the other thing I guess I didn't bring up is, it's not like I came up with this idea, right? There are other podcasters, and in fact, a lot of really top podcasters that are using this as a strategy. And so when I was looking at this, I was like, James Altucher, Pat Flynn, like they are doing this really well and really consistently, and a lot of other people aren't doing it. I think, as podcasting has become more mainstream and, as there's like kind of more seamless interaction between smartphones and computers and all of that, and I know this has happened for me. Like for example, I've read about a podcast in the New York Times and then I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I'll check it out on my phone and I'll subscribe. So I think there's a huge benefit to being multi-channel, right? People a lot of times will come to me because they want to market their podcast better. Mm-hmm. And I would say like the first thing you should do is be a guest on other people's shows. That is definitely like the best way for audience to discover you. And that's the first thing you should be doing. But, there's different levels down. And I think now there's a lot more discussion and people that are, serious about their podcasting and businesses that are podcasting are realizing, we can't just do this in a vacuum. We've got to have an email list, all the usual marketing stuff like that you would do for something else. Like a podcast is no exception. The only thing I'd say with podcasting is that the growth tends to maybe be slower, but it's a little more linear. And this is just based on having like conversations with lots of different podcast hosts. So I definitely think repurposing should be part of your strategy of how you're getting yourself out there. So if you're podcasting, for business or, to promote yourself as a freelancer or whatever it is, you're trying to get a message out there. And what repurposing does is it gets the message out there in another way. So you sort of have two options then. You can do it on your episode pages. So each episode page could have the podcast player and then, I think either have some like really good show notes that, give like a very kind of comprehensive introduction. This is what you can expect to learn. These are key takeaways and then links to resources mentioned. And that's great, right, for listeners. But if you wanted to take it one step further, and this is what I see a lot of the A-list podcasters doing, have a whole article, have something, because, I think you're not as likely to share an episode page that just has, an audio player on. You're more likely to share something that like has more text on it. Mm-hmm. So whether it be an edited transcript or something like that. Now, obviously, that's going to, if you do that for each episode, that's going to really help your SEO for your podcast website, and you're going to, over time, become more findable that way. The other approach is to use the repurposed content as guest posts. So instead of posting it on your own website, coming up with a list of, let's say, 20 targeted websites that have overlap with your audience and placing it there. You can obviously in your bio mention that this is based on an episode of your podcast so people know that, and put links to other relevant episodes of your podcast within the text of the article. But if you write something really good, place it in the right place. It's definitely over time going to help people find you. And I would just point out one quick example. There was a great example on Noah Kagan's podcast. Tyler Schulte, who has a podcast, I don't know, and I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but he talked about how he used this with the guest posting strategy with, he had a column in Kiplinger and I think a couple other places. And, like in 5 months, he saw I think he went from like a couple thousand to like 13,000 downloads a month. So it can have, real impact, but you've got to be in the right places.
Yeah, that's such a great idea. I mean, like everything you just said there was really great stuff. But man, the guest article as from a repurposed interview is so great. Cause I've some of my more popular talks is like, things I learned by asking, how did you build that? Right. And so, but it's not like an article anywhere. Like it's a talk that I gave at a conference. And so I'm definitely going to take some of your advice here and see how much I can grow my podcast at the end of the year.
We'll brainstorm at Podcast Movement.
Sounds good. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. That sounds fantastic. So as we wrap up the interview here, what are your plans for the future? Podcasting to people who have been listening to podcasts for a long time, it probably seems like podcasting is getting to its critical mass, right? But to a lot of people, this is just the beginning of podcast growth. So maybe you can give a prediction for the future and then your plans for growing your business in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I see the rise of podcasting very much like blogging, back in the day. So it was like, blogging's this hot new thing. And, younger people only read blogs. They don't read news, all these like sensational discussions about it. And then, it was like businesses were jumping on board and everyone was, launching a blog. And then, I think after a few years, only people that really kind of committed to it as a strategy really stuck with it and, were doing it for the right reasons and not because it was just the hot new thing. And so I think you'll see a lot of that with podcasts. I think it's still going to grow. I think a lot more people are going to jump in. But, probably 2 to 3 years from now, it's really more of the serious folks that are going to have stuck with it. And, all the while, what's great is because it's getting so much more attention, there's like more technologies that are making it easier, more seamless. Publishing a podcast in 2010 was like really hard. Today, not hard at all. So that's kind of where I see it going. And then there was a second question, which I totally...
I will get back to that. But what you said reminded me of, have you ever watched Parks and Rec?
Yeah.
Okay, so excellent. There is a clip of Tom Haverford, Aziz Ansari's character, listening to a podcast, and like somebody asked him, like, "Oh, like I think it was Adam Scott's character, Ben, was like, do you listen to what do you listen to on the radio?" He's like, "I don't listen to the radio. I listen to podcasts. They're totally different."
Exactly. That is the moment we are in 100%. I need to look that up. I like it.
So good. I will link that
GIF of
in
that
the
somewhere.
show notes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The second part of that question was, what are your plans for the future? Oh,
yeah. So, I mean, I'm super focused on this right now. We're I guess like November will kind of be the official 1-year anniversary of Podreacher. And my plans, are really just to focus on growing that, refining those systems, I think reaching more people, and just, finding ways to be more helpful to podcasters. I mean, this is it's something I really love doing. It's a space I love being in. So I'm 100% into the podcasts and always looking for great new podcasts to listen to as well. So
that's fantastic. And I need to end with my favorite question, of course, which is, do you have any trade secrets for us?
I would say my trade secret is probably not a secret, but I don't think enough people do it. And it's to never stop talking directly to your customers. And I guess this ties in with how we started the interview, right? With just the humanity and that kind of thing. And I also think of customers as people you sell to, but I think also people that you work with. I think of as a customer because people have a lot of choices, especially in the gig economy. And I think it's really important to just always be in touch with people's needs and be very clear on how you help in solving those needs, and to always be thinking about innovating around that. I think sometimes in the early stages of a business, like people will talk to customers, and especially if you're not in a freelance business, but then that sort of drops off. And it's something I'm challenging myself to do is to really keep in touch. And again, to the point of Facebook, to just be listening and know and understand what it is that, people are working on and needing.
Awesome. That's great. I love that. Especially the part about, it's not just people you sell to, but it's people you work with. The woman who transcribes this show, her name is Mercedes, and she emailed me and she was like, hey, it was Friday. She's like, hey, I know I'm late on this one transcript and I know you're probably anxious to get it out, but would it be okay if I did it tomorrow, meaning Saturday? It's my boyfriend's birthday and we just want to go out and celebrate. And I'm like, do it Monday. I'm like, go out, have fun.
Totally.
It's a little bit my fault for not getting her the finished episode before the episode went out. And I'm not going to be like, yeah, work on a Saturday. So I think that's really important because it forges good relationships with the people you work with and the people with whom you work for.
Exactly. And, it's a lot of people are working remotely, right? You work with people that you've never met face to face. And I think it's just easy for things to become transactional. And you have to work hard for it not to be. And like you said, I think just taking an extra minute there to be thoughtful. So I think it's really important. So I'm with you, Joe. Awesome.
Jaclyn Schiff, thank you so much for joining me today. Where can people find you?
Thank you, Joe. This has been so great. And, as I've said, I mean, I've definitely listened to your podcast for a long time, so it's an honor to be on. Podreacher.com is probably the best place. And anyone listening is welcome to email me directly with questions, or, I'm always up for a brainstorming session, anything like that. I can be reached at Jaclyn, Jaclyn, at podreacher.com.
All right. I will link that and everything we talked about in the show notes. That we have a rich show notes for this episode, which you can find over at howibuilt.it. Jaclyn, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much to Jackie for joining us this week. Again, I really loved this interview. She talked about great content strategy. Her research about cold outreach and creating resources, I think, is just something fantastic that everybody can really use. And then her trade secret, of course, never stop talking directly to your customers. This is a lesson that we learn time and time again on this show, and it's nice to hear it reinforced every so often. So thanks again to Jackie for coming on the show. Thanks to our sponsors, Ahoy, Pantheon, and Gusto. Definitely check them out, as well as all of the show notes. You can find everything we talked about on today's show over at howibuilt.it/show /145. Now, if you like this show, this episode, be sure to subscribe and leave us a rating and review over in Apple Podcasts. If you want to start a podcast of your own, Jackie and I are both big into podcasts, so I'm sure she would agree with me here. But if you want to start your own podcast, and I think you should definitely check out my podcast workbook over at howibuilt.it/liftoff. That will give you the checklists and the worksheets and some templates to help you work through starting your own show. Again, that is over at howibuilt.it/liftoff. Thanks so much for listening, and until next time, get out there and build something.